I'd like to talk a little bit about the origins of racial oppression. Um, three, three different types of intergroup contact tends to lead to different patterns of racial oppression. So I wanted to kind of briefly go over each of the three types so that everyone's kind of familiar with the concept. So the first type of intergroup contact is something we call colonization. Colonization is a form of intergroup contact that occurs when one group migrates into an area that's already occupied by another group and then proceeds to subordinate that indigenous group. So some examples of colonization would be, for example, North America being settled by the British. The British came over, established colonies in North America. They were not the only Europeans to visit North America. The French also had a significant presence, as did the Spanish. The difference is between the English and the French, or the British and the French, is that the British were essentially coming to stay. The French were interested in establishing trade relations with the indigenous population, but the British were actually fully intent on settling and turning the colonies into a place where resources could be extracted and then taken back to Britain, where they would be manufactured into finished products, which could then be sold both domestically back in Britain and of course internationally, including back in the American colonies. So obviously the kind of relationship that exists between the colonizers and the indigenous populations is going to be one of oppressive either displacement or the exploitation of the indigenous population as a labor pool. The second form of intergroup contact is something we call annexation. Now, annexation is where territory gets expanded by one group to take over territory that was formerly under the control of another group. This could be done through a number of different methods. It could be conquest. It could be a voluntary request, like, we would like to be kind of incorporated into this larger territory, or via purchase. And again, depending on which of the forms that annexation takes, it's going to dictate some very different possibilities of the relationship between the annexing group and the group that is living on the territory or the land that's being annexed. So in the case of the Louisiana Purchase, for example, that was an area or a way in which land that was claimed by France was purchased by the United States. And of course, the population living in that area is predominantly at the time Native American, right? So those groups, there was already an existing pattern in which Native Americans had come to be treated by the Anglo-European settlers and colonists, and that relationship just kind of carried over into the annexation that occurs with the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. The Mexican Cession, which is a kind of conquest annexation. So at the end of the Mexican-American War, America, as the victor, as the winner in that conflict, insisted that the Mexican government cede or hand over significant portions of its territory, essentially what is today California, Nevada, parts of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Texas, right? All of that used to be part of Mexico after the end of the Mexican-American War. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the American government essentially compels Mexico to transfer ownership of that land from Mexico to the United States. The Mexican citizens who lived on that land were, obviously then dispossessed of their citizenship, stripped of their rights, immediately become second-class citizens, right? So annexation is going to create very different kinds of relationships between the annexing group and the populations in the places being annexed. The last is immigration. Immigration is migration of one group into an area that is controlled by another group. The entering group becomes part of the indigenous group's society. And again, this can be voluntary, this can be involuntary. So the importation of African slaves is a form of immigration. In this case, the group is being brought in involuntarily. In the waves of European immigration and then subsequent immigration from other parts of the world in the United States, especially post-1965, we see voluntary immigration, people coming from other parts of Northern Europe after the initial Anglo settlers come over in the 15 and 1600s. We begin to see immigration from places like Germany or places like the Scandinavian countries. By the 1830s and 1840s, we're starting to see significant waves of Irish. By the end of the 1800s, the flow of immigration from Europe has shifted from Northern and Western Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe. We're also starting to see immigration from other parts of the world. East Asia. The Chinese immigration of the 1800s is largely involuntary. They're brought over as a labor force. And then, of course, when labor is done, when the railroads have been built or the other purposes for which you're going to use Asian labor are done, these groups are, of course, repatriated back to or sent back to their original countries. So again, depending on whether it's voluntary or involuntary, depending on the conditions in the receiving country, immigration can lead to tension-filled relationships, or sometimes more welcoming kinds of accommodations. So again, in each of these three different types of intergroup contact, there are going to be a range of possibilities with regard to the relationship between the dominant group and the established and indigenous group and the other populations that are either being annexed or being brought in through processes of immigration. So again, just a quick summary. Give you a nice little overview of the origins, the contact-based origins of patterns of racial oppression. I did want to say one thing very quickly that I didn't really elaborate on in the last video, which was a little bit about segregation, right? Because segregation is a theme that kind of runs through a lot of these intergroup relations, right? So for some populations of people in the United States, for example, immigrant groups, outsider groups who are coming into the United States end up sort of assimilating or at the very least engaging in a kind of Anglo conformity that allows them to kind of fit in and be part of the sort of the mainstream culture and social group. Other groups face some resistance, and one of the things that seems to facilitate either increased rates of assimilation or a slow process of assimilation or a lack of assimilation entirely is the degree to which groups are segregated or integrated. So a segregated society is one in which society's been divided up into two or more separate groups that occupy separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate workplaces. When subordinate groups are segregated, as they often are in American society, it makes it sometimes very difficult for them to take advantage of opportunities that exist, so say, for example, in other parts of an urban area or other parts of a state or a region. So that theme of segregation and the role that it plays in shaping the kind of experiences that racial and ethnic minority groups have is going to be something important and something to keep in mind. All right, so that'll wrap us up for this session. I'll see you next time.